Good evening. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our program, a presentation and discussion of Jim Wallis's important new book, The Great Awakening, Reviving Faith and Politics in a Post-Religious Right America. A suggestive title, a timely topic. I think you'll agree there's a lot to talk about. The Berkley Center, as you can tell from our title, takes primarily a comparative and international approach to religion and politics. But that approach must, I think, encompass what happens in the United States, the most powerful country in the world, a country where, of course, religion and politics have always been intertwined, both in domestic affairs and in foreign policy. On the domestic front, let me just note one of the things the center does. We have a website called faith2008.org that tracks religious rhetoric in the presidential campaign. And we also collaborate with the Washington Post's On Faith site on these issues. And there's a blog there by one of my colleagues, Jacques Berliner-Blau, on the suggestive, or with the suggestive title, The God Vote. Tonight's program is a collaboration with Sojourners, the path-breaking organization founded by Jim Wallis, which I think more than perhaps any other organization has really explored that intersection between faith and public affairs in this country and also in an international and global context. So we welcome Sojourners to Georgetown. We look forward to this event and to other collaborations in the future. It's now my pleasure to introduce President Dionne J. DeGioia, who will introduce both of our speakers. Dr. DeGioia has served as president of Georgetown University since 2001. Prior to his appointment, he served for some 22 years in various administrative and leadership positions in this university, including as senior vice president and as dean of student affairs. He has a BA in English from Georgetown and a PhD in philosophy from this university as well. And as president, I think it's worth underlining, as president, he's been able to stay active in the classroom, teaching in the Department of Philosophy on topics ranging from the practice of leadership to ethics and global development. President DeGioia is a member of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and the chair of its Education Committee. He represents Georgetown on the Council of Foreign Relations and at the World Economic Forum. Finally, and especially relevant, I think, in tonight's context, President DeGioia has been a tremendous supporter of work at the Berkley Center and across campus, work designed to further the interdisciplinary study of religion and the promotion of interreligious understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, President Jack DeGioia.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I'd like to express my thanks to both the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and to Sojourners for co-sponsoring this event. The Berkley Center is one of the many initiatives that Georgetown has undertaken to try to make a difference, to make a contribution in the global community by leveraging our traditional strengths in interreligious dialogue and interfaith issues. In 1968, we were the first Catholic university to hire a full-time rabbi, and nearly a decade ago, the first American university to hire a full-time Muslim chaplain. And for 14 years, our Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding has been an outstanding resource for lively exchanges and educational programs at the intersection of Muslim-Christian dialogue. Additionally, other efforts include the Program for Jewish Civilization, our doctoral program in religious pluralism and theology, and our distinguished lecture series on interreligious dialogue. And as Tom mentioned, we recently joined with the Washington Post and with Newsweek magazine on a collaborative online effort called On Faith, which will serve as a multi-denominational discussion forum. Georgetown scholars and students act as regular contributors in this context. Last week, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the Council of 100 leaders, 100 religious leaders, released a landmark report called Islam in the West, an annual report on the state of the dialogue. And that document, which is a formal collaboration between the World Economic Forum and Georgetown, is the very first of its kind, a systematic overview of Muslim-West relations in their political, social, economic, and cultural dimensions. And both our Berkley Center and our Prince Al-Walid Center provided the academic oversight for that report. So we are dedicated here to providing opportunities for people from different nations and communities, people from different religious backgrounds to engage in constructive and engaged and deeply, we're working at dialogue that tries to break free and break through some of the boundaries that have blocked us in our ability to communicate more effectively across our differences. And that's why, for me, it's a distinct privilege to introduce two dear friends and two individuals who have had such a profound and constructive effect on the state of American discourse today. Reverend Jim Wallis has significantly enhanced the debate surrounding religious politics in our country today. As you know, the founder and editor of Sojourners magazine, the convener of A Call to Renewal, an interfaith effort to end poverty. Through his efforts, he has helped to build a community and a movement that is transforming the way that we view faith and public life. He also truly embodies the spirit of religious understanding and moral leadership, continually championing the principles of human dignity and social justice. We were privileged to have him with us this past May when he addressed our most recent class of undergraduates as the speaker at our undergraduate commencement ceremonies. Many of us were fortunate enough to hear from his ideas and insights, and I know that his remarks inspired and enlightened thousands of young women and men who had the privilege to be with us last May. We were also honored at that time to have the opportunity to bestow upon Jim Wallis an honorary degree from Georgetown University. After Reverend Wallis speaks, we will hear a response from E.J. Dionne, who serves as university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture here at Georgetown University. A longtime columnist for the Washington Post, E.J. has established a reputation as one of America's foremost political journalists and commentators. His work truly shows the kind of reflective engagement in our community that we strive to provide the context for our faculty to make. We're honored to have him as a member of the Georgetown community and to have him with us this evening to share his thoughts with us. At this point, it's a distinct pleasure for me to first introduce Reverend Jim Wallis, who will offer us an opportunity to benefit from his experience and wisdom, and then following his remarks, E.J. will be offering his perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Reverend Jim Wallis.
Thank you, Jack. I met Jack DeGioia on a panel at Davos last year. We're sitting next to each other, and we'd never met before. So we met in Switzerland, halfway around the world. And I so liked what he had to say that I said, we should do this more often. And we're beginning to do that, so thank you very much. And Tom, the Center Sojourners, is very pleased to be doing this with the Berkley Center, a center that is more and more at the center of things when it comes to the dialogue we need between faith communities. I'm a member of that Council of 100 group at Davos, and the report that was just offered, I'm anxious to read it now. I missed this year because of this book launch, but I'm anxious to read the report because it really is a landmark, and it's going to be every year, I believe, right? So an ongoing conversation that the center is helping to lead, and I'm very pleased to be a part of this. And EJ and I have been friends for a long time, co-conspirators on faith and justice, so I'm happy to be here with EJ again. And all of you, thank you for coming tonight. I have sometimes been known as called a progressive evangelical. And then they say, and that's a misnomer. Well, the misnomer is becoming a movement, and that's a good thing. Evangelicals are known for bringing good news. That's what we're supposed to do. And so I've got some good news and then some better news. The good news is that the dominance of the religious right over our politics, I think, has finally come to an end. That's not to say the religious right is gone or dead. In fact, I have regular conversations with many of their leaders now on issues of mutual concern, like Darfur and so many other things. But now the monologue is over, and a dialogue has just begun. And that is good news for the church and for politics. The better news is that now people of faith, especially a new generation, has really come of age and is applying their faith, using their faith to address the most significant challenges that we face in our time. Faith is being directly applied to the moral scandal of poverty, the degradation of the environment which many of us call God's creation, the threat of climate change, pandemic diseases that ravage the globe, trafficking in human beings, human rights, Darfur, the cultural assault on our families and our children, and I would say the exclusive use of war to fight the problem and real problem of evil and the disastrous foreign policy that has led to. So I want to begin with two jokes from Washington tonight. The first joke is a religious one, the second's a political one. The religious one is, in the Senate dining room, a Republican and Democrat are having lunch together. You know this is made up because they never talk to each other anymore. But in the story, the Republican says to the Democrat, "You Democrats don't understand religion. You haven't got a clue. You just don't get it." The Democrat says, "We do too. We're very religious. We really are." Republican says, "I've got $20." It says, "You can't recite the Lord's Prayer right here and right now." He says, "Yes, I can too," and he begins. "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." Republican pulls out $20 and says, "Darn, I didn't think you could do it." Yeah. Now that joke was told me by Richard Land, who is a card-carrying member of the religious right, and we both agree now that this notion of God being on one side of the aisle or another is really silly. God is not a Republican or a Democrat, and people of faith should be in no party's political pocket or candidates. We should be, in fact, maybe the ultimate swing vote, evaluating politics and candidates by our moral compass. Martin Luther King Jr. never endorsed a candidate. He asked them to endorse the agenda of his movement. And I find some wisdom in there for an election year. And now we've seen the leveling of the praying field, as Time magazine has called that. I like that clever turn of the phrase, where this time you have the three Democratic front runners. We convened a forum with CNN last summer with them about faith, values, and poverty. And all three spoke comfortably, authentically as people of faith, like their politics or not. They were speaking legitimately as people of faith and applying their faith to issues beyond the old narrow agenda. So I think that's a good thing for all of us, that now we can have a more honest conversation. Second joke is a political one. This fellow's drowning in the Potomac, and he's going down about 100 feet offshore, and he's going down fast, and the Republicans rush down the river to try and help him. And he's 100 feet offshore, and they throw him 50 feet of rope, and they say, "The rest is up to you." The Democrats hear about this problem and rush down to do better, they think. And now he's really going down 100 feet offshore, and the Democrats throw him 200 feet of rope and then let go of their end, which is a silly way to say that politics is broken in this country. 70% of the American people now believe, and the data polling on this is consistent, that we're going in the wrong direction. When politics fails to resolve or even address our most serious issues, our biggest moral questions, what often happens is that social movements rise up to change politics. And the best social movements have spiritual foundations. So in this book, The Great Awakening, I did a lot of, for me, exciting research on great awakenings in our history, our American past, times when the revival of faith led to real changes in a society. And I learned the church historians make it clear that spiritual activity or renewal doesn't get to be counted as revival until it has changed something in the society. So we have all these first, second, third, fourth Great Awakenings, and they led to significant shifts, changes of direction in a society. And they led to the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, child labor law reform, and of course, civil rights. Those social movements, progressive social movements, have never happened without the involvement, significant involvement of people of faith. Never have happened without the involvement of people of faith. Yet, religion has no monopoly on morality. And those movements are never just people of faith. It's always people of faith and goodwill, and those who, now there's a whole new movement I meet around the country, the spiritual but not religious. It's a new denomination. Have you heard about this one? It's growing rapidly. Ben Cohen, Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream, tells me that he's spiritual but not religious. I said, Ben, offer him free ice cream. You could be the bishop of this new denomination. He told me he's thinking about that. But I think there are two great hungers in our world today. The hunger for spirituality and the hunger for social justice. And the connection between the two is the one our world is waiting for, especially a new generation. That really is the focus of this book. I think there are dramatic changes occurring in the religious community that could impact this election, but even more important, beyond the election. 2008 will be a very different kind of election year than we saw in 2004. What has changed? In my last book, God's Politics, I said basically that when someone hijacks your faith, that's how it felt to a lot of us. When my wife's English, so I'm on the BBC sometimes, and the BBC listeners are startled to hear an American Christian voice, particularly an evangelical, who doesn't think God is an American, or only a Republican, who only cares about abortion and gay marriage. And to hear a broader agenda is always a very refreshing thing for them. Well, the Great Awakening is not about the religious right at all. It's not about them at all. Because millions have taken back their faith. And now this book is about what are we going to do with our faith now that we've taken it back. It's not about somebody else or about our critique of them. It's what are we going to do with our own faith. And so we've seen the leveling of the playing field. We see, as EJ can speak to more than I, how all the three candidates are having high-powered faith outreach operations going. There are faith forums in New Hampshire and Iowa and gospel tours in South Carolina. But more important than that political change is how the agenda has changed. Rick Cizik of the National Association of Evangelicals was on a panel we had this last week in D.C. We had a number of evangelical voices. Lynn Hybels of Willow Creek in Chicago, Sam Rodriguez, the Hispanic evangelical leader, Rich Cizik, Cheryl Saunders from Church of God here in town, Joel Hunter from Florida. These are new evangelical voices, and Rich said the change is so dramatic, he called it a slow earthquake happening among evangelicals, where poverty, climate change, disease, war and peace, immigration, racial justice are all now on the agenda. The former agenda was too narrow, unbiblically narrow, I would say, too partisan, and much too top-down. A new generation has a new agenda. It is wider, it is deeper, it is less partisan, less focused on top-down, and more concerned about grassroots, bottom-up social change. It has a new face. I was in New York for the first day of this book launch, and I had a wonderful time with about 60 evangelical Pentecostal pastors in New York City, most of whom are old friends. And more than half the room is black and brown. And they said, you know, when the media talks about evangelicals, they really mean white evangelicals. They act like we don't exist. Please tell them that we exist. And then in wonderful Pentecostal fashion, they proceeded to lay hands on me to pray at the beginning of a 20-city, 6-week book tour. And the power of faith in that room was palpable. It felt like a revival going on in that room in New York City, a wonderful way to start a book tour like this. This new face is black, brown, women, young people, as well as older people. And I think that it's clear now that evangelicals, if you will, are leaving the religious right in droves. I meet pastors all over the country. You've heard about Rick Warren and Bill Hybels. They're talked about in the book, but there's a whole second tier of very young, bright, creative pastors who are really social entrepreneurs in many ways. And their creativity and their reaching out to a new generation is very exciting to see. Then the students. I'm on campuses a lot these days, and there's a new student movement I find growing up that more than I've seen in probably 30 years. And where it's happening is interesting. It's happening, in my experience, most at two places: evangelical Christian campuses and Jesuit Catholic schools. It's not happening so much at the old bastions of liberal left activism. There's, in those places, a lot of political correctness, but not a lot of activism, a lot of energy, a lot of passion. The passion is with the students who are being nurtured by their faith. And for me, I find that especially meaningful, because when I was a young kid, and I had these stirrings about racism in Detroit, I got kicked out of my little church at 14 over the issue of race. To become a social activist, I had to leave my church and the faith that I was brought up in. I came back to it later. But now this generation is, in fact, being sustained and nurtured by their very faith, and I think offering a very exciting new movement. They tell me the religious right has been replaced by Jesus. That's kind of a simple and wonderful way to put it. Some claps for Jesus over there on the side. So it must be one of those evangelicals. I was honored to do the commencement speech, as Jack said, this past spring. And what I said to Georgetown students here was very simple, that each generation has two questions to answer, two questions. And their answers are decisive for social change. First question is, what is acceptable? What is acceptable to you? So much of what we live with and we shouldn't live with is because things that are not tolerable have been tolerated. We've accepted things for far too long. 30,000 children died again yesterday, and today, and will tomorrow, because of utterly stupid poverty, as Bono calls it, and completely preventable disease. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of Britain, once said to me, he said, you know, we have the knowledge and the technology and the resources and the information to end extreme poverty as we know it. We don't have the moral and the political will. Looked across the table and said, that's your job in the churches, and he's right. He's right. What is acceptable? When things suddenly are no longer acceptable, that's the beginning of change. But also, the second question, what is possible? What is possible? When we don't think that change is really possible, something really shrinks in our passion and our capacity to change it. Last year I did the commencement here at this great university. This year I'm doing the commencement at Sing Sing Prison in upstate New York. I first met these prisoners when I got a letter one day in the mail. Come speak to us, they said. Sounded interesting, so I wrote back and said, well, when do you want me to come? And this young brother wrote back on behalf of his colleagues. He said, well, we're free most nights. He said, we're kind of a captive audience here. So I went, and it was all arranged, and I was left alone with these 80 guys for about 5 hours in the bowels of that infamous prison one night. And I'll never forget that night. A young man came up to me and said, "You know, Jim, all of us here at Sing Sing are from just about 4 or 5 neighborhoods in New York City. 4 or 5 neighborhoods. It's like a train," he said. The train begins in my neighborhood and ends up at places like Sing Sing. Fast-moving urban train, beginning in only certain zip codes, ending up at inevitable destinations like Sing Sing prison. But he'd had a spiritual conversion inside the walls, and he told me about it, because the New York Theological Seminary has a program inside the walls of Sing Sing, training masters of divinity inside the joint. And you graduate when your sentence is up. And he told me, when I get out, I want to go back and stop that train. I was in New York 2 years later and on a town meeting on poverty, and guess who was up front? 2 of those young men back home stopping that train. One of them was the one who laid hands on me to pray just last week. He's ordained now. He's back in the hood, back in the city, back in the streets, trying to stop that train. But what those young men taught me was, you know, when you're in prison, you're in this country, you're likely already poor, and now you're at the bottom. And yet at the bottom, they learn the simple insight that faith is for the big stuff, the really big things, the things that are too much for us, that are beyond our capacity and control, where the odds are against us. That's why we call it faith. And the Bible says if you got faith the size of the grain of a mustard seed, what can you move? Mountains. See this Catholic, biblical, literal audience here. You can move mountains. And so sometimes I think we ought to just start passing out mustard seeds at these revivals around the country, because I think, in fact, it will take something like faith to reach what Malcolm Gladwell calls a tipping point on the big issues. So this book takes up 7 big issues, 7 things that will do us in if we don't turn them around. And each chapter ends with not just a lament of the issue and how bad it is and wrong it is and how bad we should all feel. It says the commitment. And first, it's personal. What each of us can do in our own lives, our families, with our kids. That may be the most important thing of all. What we teach our kids to do. Second, communally, congregationally, our groups in our neighborhoods, our communities. What can we do to lead at the neighborhood level? And finally, public policy. Because you can't keep pulling bodies out of the river and not send somebody upstream to see what or who is throwing them in. But the agreement has to be personal, communal, and public policy. So I just got very inspired by these great awakenings. And in the second Great Awakening, my favorite evangelist, Charles Finney, the Billy Graham of his day, was a revivalist, evangelist, and an abolitionist. And he was the one who pioneered what we know as the altar call today, because here's how he used the altar call. He wanted to sign his converts up for the anti-slavery campaign. That's why we first had an altar call. So tonight, on your way, I encourage you to, whether you buy a book or not, to get a card, and we'll sign you up at Sojourners. We're doing email altar calls around the country, because we want people to not just buy books, but to sign up for a movement. And I think a movement is now really beginning to emerge. So at an event in Chicago recently, I was talking about William Wilberforce, you know, the great British parliamentarian who led the battle against the slave trade, and of course, Dr. King. And afterwards, at the end of the line of students, there was these 2 young women. I could tell they had something to say to me. They were just waiting and waiting. Sure enough, when I got there, they said, "We just wanted you to know, we are going to be the next William Wilberforce and Martin Luther King Jr." I said, "Well, it's good to meet you now before you're famous and you got time to talk, you know." But they were serious. They were very serious about who and what they wanted to be. I think a new political agenda may emerge from this. I'm calling it the moral center, not a soulless centrism or a mushy middle. But don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. What are the moral challenges and choices that lie right beneath our political debate. Most of the big issues have an essentially moral character, which is why we could bring people together across normal political boundaries around these big moral questions. So I'm talking to more and more people on the conservative side. What would your agenda be for serious poverty reduction? If we agree that is a moral imperative, how can fighting poverty be a nonpartisan issue and a bipartisan cause? Give me your best ideas. We haven't solved this. The poor are trapped in our debate about poverty, not just in poverty. How can we find common ground by moving to higher ground, even on the divisive issues like abortion and family and gay marriage? I think the book talks about how we could find some new ways to find solutions. Washington, D.C., and EJ knows this well, both sides do it. They take a problem, they do two things. They want to make us afraid of it, and then blame it on the other side. Then take a poll to see whose spin won. They never get back to solving the problem, and they act like every problem has only two sides, and the media are even worse sometimes. They have these pre-interviews before you go on a TV show, and they're really auditions to see if the talking heads have enough conflict to make for good television. How do we get to solutions? How do we replace a politics of fear and blame with what the country's hungry for, which is a politics of solutions and hope? That's what we have to do. EJ has got a book coming out that I've read, and it's excellent about this same, the politics of the common good. I think EJ writes about that better than any columnist in America. What is the politics of the common good? I talk in the book, it has deep Catholic roots for sure, in the black church and mainline churches, but also in Islam, Judaism, and in our secular traditions. The common good is something we can access from many different places, religious and non-religious, and may be the beginning of our future. We're in the horse race now, and I want to announce the winner there's already a winner in this election. The winner is change. Change has won the election already. Everybody wants change, and now they're competing for who is going to be the best agent of change. Both sides, even Republicans, say they want change, and their parties have been in power. Everybody now says they want change. But I want to say, whoever your favorite candidate is tonight, they won't be able to change the big issues unless and until there are social movements pressuring from the outside. We had a big flap lately about LBJ and Martin King. I want to say that Lyndon Johnson wasn't a civil rights leader until Martin King and Rosa Parks made him one. Movements change politics and make politicians into political leaders. I want to read to you just the last two paragraphs of the book. Writing this book, the writing and the praying and the vocational discernment got all mixed up for me, all tangled up in the writing of this book. And I emerged from this more clear than ever that I just want to be a revival preacher. And so at the end, it's called Justice Revivals, Coming to a City Near You. A genuine spiritual revival may be coming to a city near you. Imagine something called Justice Revivals, in the powerful tradition of revivals past, but focusing on the great moral issues of our time. Imagine powerful preaching and music at night with marches in the street during the day. Imagine linking the tradition of Billy Graham with the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. Imagine a new generation of young people catching fire and offering their gifts and talents and lives in a new spiritual movement for social justice. Imagine such revivals taking place in our city's great convention centers, but resulting in thousands of small groups for ongoing discipleship, training, and action in every neighborhood of those cities. Imagine disillusioned believers coming back to faith after many years of alienation, while other seekers discover the power of faith for the very first time. And Tom, imagine a revival of faith that didn't result in sectarian warfare, but rather respectful dialogue between our diverse religious communities and a new interfaith collaboration in overcoming the social crises that confront us all. Imagine politics being unable to co-opt such a spiritual revival, but being held accountable to its moral imperatives. Imagine social movements rising out of spiritual revival and actually changing the wind of both our culture and our politics. Imagine a fulfillment in our time of the words of the prophet Amos, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Just imagine. You know, we just started this book tour, and one question is emerging from all the interviewers, the journalists, and I'll close with this. The big question is, all week long they've been saying things like this. We have a great conversation, they're excited, but then they say, "This is a very hopeful book." And I said, I feel hopeful. He said, well, they look at me longingly and they say, "Do you think we can have that kind of hope?" They want to, I can tell, but they're cynical because the big choice in our time is between hope and cynicism. The cynics see the world as it is, realistically, no rose-colored glasses, and the cynics are against all the bad stuff. They really are. But they don't think it'll ever really change, so cynicism becomes a buffer against commitment. Hope, on the other hand, is not a personality trait or a state of mind. Hope is a decision, a choice you make because of this thing that we call faith. And making the choice for hope is always what makes change possible. So I'll close with a story showing this isn't utopian. This is the heart of realism about what changes things. I remember being involved in South Africa for many years in the worst times, the darkest times when the ANC was, you couldn't say it out loud, Nelson Mandela was in prison. The only ones left standing were religious leaders like the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I remember being snuck in the country clandestinely to dialogue with our brothers and sisters about a campaign that became the sanctions campaign against the Pretoria government. I remember meeting Desmond Tutu at his cathedral in St. George's one morning. A political rally had been planned and then canceled by the government. So Archbishop Tutu said, "Okay, we're going to just have church. Try and cancel that." And they didn't want to cancel that, so we had church, and we all gathered there. And there were more police and military outside than there were worshipers on the inside. They outnumbered us 3-1. They were meant to intimidate, to frighten us, and at least with me, it was working pretty well. We're all huddled there, and Archbishop Tutu rose to preach in his little pulpit. Little man, long flowing robes, and he began to preach, and just as he did, they actually broke down the doors at the back of his cathedral at St. George's. They broke it down, and they rushed in, and they lined the walls, South African security police, who were thugs. I've been interrogated by them. They are thugs. They had tape recorders, and they had pads, as if to say, "Go ahead, be bold, be prophetic. We'll get it down. We'll get you. We'll put you back in prison." They were there saying, "We own this place. We own your religion. We own you." And he stopped talking. We wondered what he would say. He looked at them, one side and the other, back and forth. Then he pointed his finger at them. He said, You are powerful. You are very powerful, but you are not gods. And I serve a God who will not be mocked. Then he smiled that famous signature Desmond Tutu smile that you've seen on television. And he said, he began to laugh at them, though politely, he is an Anglican bishop. He said, "So, since you have already lost, I invite you today to come and join the winning side." And the place erupted, and young people began dancing this chanting, stomping dance called the Toi Toi. They danced us out to the streets, and the police moved back. They didn't expect dancing worshipers. We danced in the streets. 10 years later, I was blessed to be at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, and the master of ceremonies was the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I said, "Bishop, do you remember that morning at St. George's? Remember what you said?" He smiled. He remembered. I said, "Bishop, today they've all joined the winning side. There wasn't a white person in all of South Africa who hadn't always been against apartheid on that day." He showed me how faith prompts hope, leads to action, and makes change. That's the chain. Always faith, hope, action, and change. It's the logic of history. He's not an eccentric old man. He understood how history works. He said, as Christians, he said, we are prisoners of hope. I think a time has come to claim that chain of action, to understand who we are as people of faith. It's okay to be at the party, the celebration of Nelson Mandela's inauguration. 150,000 South Africans, tears streaming down our faces. But where we're needed is not at the party, but back at St. George's, when the only ones who can see the party and see the celebration are those who can see through the eyes of faith. And they believe that day is possible, and they bet their lives on that possibility. Change begins over here with someone back there deciding it is possible and betting their lives upon it. Great Awakenings have done that before. They can do it again. We may be at the beginning of that right now. And I think, despite all of the challenges that we face, I think that it may happen because I believe we are on the winning side. Thank you very much.
Now, God can be discovered anywhere, so there's nothing wrong with finding God in the exit polls. But the effect of discovering God in the exit polls was that a lot of them immediately went out and bought Jim Wallis's great book, God's Politics. And I am here just to give testimony that Jim Wallis did not discover God in the exit polls of 2004. In fact, I first got to know Jim Wallis long before I met him. When I started seeing the work he was doing with his friend Wes Michelson around this little magazine called Sojourners. And here were two people of faith, of powerful evangelical faith, who had been active in civil rights, were active in the peace movement, and saw an organic link between their faith and a certain style of political action. You have to understand, Jim and Wes looked weird to a lot of people back in 1970. They were voices crying out in the wilderness. Among their political allies, people would say, you know, how can Jim be this liberal or progressive and care so much about religion? It just doesn't make any sense. And on the religious side, it would be, how can Jim have all these pinko ideas and claim to believe in Jesus? And so Jim worked and he worked and he worked. And suddenly, to quote Jim Wallis, he was on the winning side. Suddenly, a lot of people discovered that there are links among these things. Now, Sojourners put out a little bumper sticker a few years ago, and the bumper sticker said, "God is not a Republican," and then underneath ... or a Democrat. Now, my partisan son said, "That's a great bumper sticker. Why don't you cut off the bottom part, you know, and we can put that on our car." And I think one of the lessons that Jim has to teach, and that a lot of us have been discussing for a while, is, first of all, this notion that religion only lives on the right side of the political spectrum has long been a mistake. Jim has heard me tell one of my favorite stories for many years about Mrs. O'Reilly, who is being taken to the polls one day by her son. Her son is she is a loyal Democrat. Her son is upper middle class, has started voting for a lot of Republicans. He asks his mom, "Mom, how are you going to vote?" And she says, as always, straight Democratic. And the son says, "You know, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him." And Mrs. O'Reilly said, "Oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years?" Now, so that this has not always been the case, that religion was seen as only being on one side of the political spectrum. Religious faith, in fact, and this is one of the core messages of Jim's book and of all his work, far from being inevitably on the side of the status quo, should on principle hold this world to higher standards. Religious people should always be wary of the ways in which political power is wielded and skeptical about how economic privileges are distributed. They should be wary of how their own traditions have been used for narrow political purposes, sometimes by one side, sometimes by the other. And this is especially obvious in the Christian and Jewish scriptures, have always preached a hope for more just and decent human arrangements. One of my sort of things that I've sort of held dear to is the idea of hope, just like Jim, and I think that hope is the virtue on which faith and love depend. And I said that one day, and a friend of mine said, you know, you're picking a fight with St. Paul. You know, the greatest of these is love. I don't think I am picking a fight with St. Paul, and I was very grateful to read Pope Benedict's recent encyclical on hope, and he sort of didn't think I was picking a fight with St. Paul, so I felt a certain blessing there. Jim's bumper sticker is right. Linking religion too closely to the fortunes of one political party, one leader, one group of leaders is always a mistake. It encourages alienation from faith itself by turning a concern with the ultimate into a prop for temporal power. Where, after all, did Voltaire come from? Where have the new atheist writers come from? Except, I believe, in a backlash against a great sellout of our religious traditions. It is a great sellout of our religious traditions to say they have much to teach us about abortion or gay marriage, but little useful to say about justice, social justice, war and peace, the organization of our work lives, or how we provide for the old, the sick, and the desperate. Religion actually becomes less relevant to public life when its role is marginalized to a predetermined list of values issues, when its voice is silenced or softened on the central problems facing our country. Remember that exit poll question back in 2004? People were asked why they voted, and a certain percentage, I think it was 22% said they voted on moral values. Now, I always ask folks when I talk to them about this, did anybody in this room cast their ballot that year on the basis of immoral values? I'm always looking for the person because I want to invite them out for a drink after if somebody's hand goes up there. And so there was an inclination to check that box. But think about it. The other issues on the list included the Iraq War, education, the economy, taxes, and the environment, and justice. Did that make you immoral? Did that mean that those were not moral values, that your concern for the economy, for the poor, for education, for the environment were not moral concerns? They have fixed that exit poll question, but we still need to repair our thinking on the thinking that went into that question, and Jim Wallis's book is a great contribution to that. The end of the religious right, and I too believe the era of the religious right is over, does not signal a decline in evangelical Christianity. It does not signal a decline in the power of religion. On the contrary, if a Catholic may use this term, I think it is the sign of a new reformation among those who are disentangling a great movement from a political machine. And this historic change will require liberals and conservatives alike to abandon their sometimes narrow views of who religious people are and what they believe. David Quo, a good friend of both of ours who worked in the Bush administration, wrote a very powerful book recently, and he argued that there is something wrong with reducing Jesus to a precinct captain, to some get-out-the-vote guy. It just doesn't seem like a very accurate view of Jesus. I am impatient, as I say, with where the religious discourse have been, and I share with Jim the hope that both our political and religious discourse are moving in a very different direction. Yaroslav Pelikan, the wonderful writer, once said that tradition is the living religion of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead religion of the living. And I think those of us who care about our religious traditions accept the fact that religion is necessarily both conservative and progressive. Religion is rooted in tradition, and it survives through the development and change within tradition. It applies old truths to new circumstances. It also re-examines old truths in light of new circumstances. The conservative insists that tradition not be distorted merely to accommodate passing fads and fashions. The progressive insists on purifying and clarifying tradition by freeing it from the distortions and cultural encrustations of the past. The conservative keeps tradition alive by honoring it. The progressive keeps tradition alive by adapting it and sometimes by challenging it. I think the history of American democracy shows that religious conservatives and progressives need each other far more than we know. I think the election of 2008, coming after a long period of profound division in our politics and within our religious communities, will mark the moment when we finally come to understand that truth. Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs has argued that the role of religion is not to divide the world, it is to heal a fractured world. I salute Jim for his engagement in a ministry of justice, a ministry that challenges us all to heal our fractured world. Thank you very much. While I'm waiting, but somebody should get up there, let me ask Jim, I know that you know a number of these political candidates very well, and we've talked about this a lot, that in the past it often seemed that there's the old line that in Hollywood somebody said what you need is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you can do anything. And every so often when some people on the progressive side sort of pull out scripture, they sometimes put the wrong book in the wrong part of the Bible and so on. Yet this time, or the wrong pope in the wrong century has happened too. This time you have candidates who are on the Democratic side who are quite fluent with faith. You also have on the Republican side Mike Huckabee, who's an extremely, I think, interesting evangelical, because he has a little bit of that William Jennings Bryan streak of populism in him. So could you sort of talk a little bit concretely about this campaign, and then, bless you both, you will be the first and second questioners.
I remember in Boston, the first week of the last book tour for God's Politics, there was a questioner at the end, or just, he said, I'm gay. Thanks for making me feel so welcome tonight. But you know what? It's easier to come out as gay in Boston than as religious in the Democratic Party. And I think there was a certain truth to that when he said that, but it really isn't true anymore. Now, what EJ said is all true. Partly, some of this is Democrats began to do the math, you might say. Some of that was going on, but there also was a number of Democratic office holders would always tell me they felt like they were in the closet in terms of their religion, and now they've come out of the closet, and so there's been some stumbling around. But these three Democratic front runners, I've known Barack and Hillary for 10 years, and Edwards is for less time, but for a few years. And I was always struck when people would talk about, when a reporter would call you about Hillary's religion, and they would say, when did she first sound religious to you or talk to you about religion? I said, well, when we first met 10 years ago, and they couldn't believe that. And the assumption was Democrats must be pandering if they talk about religion. And she's a Methodist kid from Chicago, did urban plunges with a Methodist youth leader who was very influential in her life, and that has shaped her politics ever since. And Barack, the other media assumption, well, he's a Christian because he's black. Well, Barack was from a very secular family, and he had a conversion experience on the South Side as an organizer. And our talks 10 years ago were about three things, always three things, and we met about the same time. And one was about how politics is polarized and paralyzed, and until we get beyond this left-right gridlock, we can't find solutions. One, the critical connection between progressive faith and politics. And three, we were both young parents with young kids, or older parents, dads with young kids. We talk about parenting a lot. And Barack, we had him speak at our Pentecost gathering 2 years ago. about faith and politics. And I think it was the most important speech on that topic since Kennedy's Houston talk in 1960. And he was a Democrat talking like a public theologian about these issues. Edwards, both of them are very devout. They don't talk about it as much, but privately they do a lot. And they're also, and Edwards on our forum talked very knowledgeably and movingly about what faith meant to him during the time when he lost his son and critical moments in their lives. Huckabee is the only Republican who is explicitly evangelical, and yet the leaders of the religious right didn't support him. None of them did. They didn't back him. And their argument was he couldn't win. But they had a lot of power to make him a contender. They chose not to, but then the grassroots of his right did make him a contender. And E.J. is right. He has a blend of economic populism and social conservatism that makes him a very interesting candidate. And he also says the agenda for evangelicals is broader than just two issues. He talks about the environment. He talks about U.S. foreign policy as being an arrogant bunker. He talks about, and he was described by Richard Viguerie in the Washington Times as a Christian socialist because he spent money on poor people in Arkansas and believes that's part of what you should do. So it's a very interesting sort of field now, and I think it's put to rest the idea that one party is hostile and secular and the other is religious. And that, I think, is a good thing for politics and a good thing for religion.
Well, first of all, Reverend Wallis, I want to tell you what an incredible inspiration you are to me. I've never felt so much hope myself since I stumbled on your book, God's Politics, in the bookstore and thought, that's interesting. Let's see what that's about. And then I joined Sojourners and so on. And since there's a short line, I sort of have two questions. One is about what seems to be the inevitable co-opting of religion for nationalism, because religion is such a feature of a person's identity, and that seems to translate into nationalism, and that seems to translate into one-upmanship, arrogance, conflict, and war. And the second question is about war. I've never understood, I still don't theologically, how any Christian can go to war when God has told us, thou shalt not kill. And I equally don't understand how we can avoid being exterminated if we don't. So can you help me understand these things?
Well, the first thing you said, I want to affirm the joining Sojourners part. We really want people to join with us and we think there's a movement afoot, and I hope you do sign up afterwards. We talk now to about 250,000 people a week around the country, and it really feels like a growing movement. In chapter 3 is the most theological chapter in the book, and it's about, basically it's called How to Change the World and Why, Rules of Engagement. It talks about, because it's not just true that we should change the world, that's true, but what does that mean? What's a theological approach that has integrity? And so one of the principles there, one of the 7 rules, is about take a global perspective. My wife's English, and soon after she came here, she asked me one day, don't they know that God bless America is not found anywhere in the Bible? It's right next to that verse. It says those who, God helps those who help themselves, I suppose. I think there is a real, I did a controversial piece about Iraq a while back, and it said, I think the issue here is not just evaluations of conditions for a just war, which was the rage before we went to war, but it was really, to whom do we belong? There's a fact the media never really reported, which was a majority of Christians and church leaders and church people around the world, a vast majority, and a vast majority of evangelicals around the world were opposed to the war in Iraq from the start. Vast majorities, even in countries like Britain, where they joined the coalition. Now, what do American Christians know that the rest of Christendom didn't know. Actually, we often know less than the rest of Christendom knows, that made us know that this was a war worth fighting. And as Rich Nathan, a Vineyard pastor, puts it in the book, he's not a pacifist, but he says he believes in the just war, the Augustinian notion of just war. Why is it that followers of the Prince of Peace are the easiest to convince to go to war? Shouldn't we be the hardest? Shouldn't we demand the most rigorous criteria? And you could also ask the question, why should we depend on our government leaders' evaluations on whether a war is a just war instead of our own moral compass and criteria? So these are questions we try to raise in the book, and I do have a section called Nonviolent Realism, and I want to stress the realism, because I do think we have been sometimes buffeted between alternatives that aren't really sufficient. I do think there is a kind of liberal pacifism that underestimates the reality and threat of evil in the world, real evil in the world. But then there's a mistake, which I call conservative combat, which thinks that you can easily smash evil with military power. And in fact, it doesn't always work that way. There are unintended consequences, and things break out someplace else. Sometimes you have to constrain, contain, surround, and undermine evil from within, not by attacking it from without. So I go through all this in some depth, but I think we need a different alternative than the just war and pacifist pulpits screaming at each other, but get down into the mud of conflict resolution. The real issue here is, how do you resolve the inevitable conflicts that human beings and nations are going to have? That's what this chapter is about. Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, sir, for joining us at Georgetown tonight.
Thank you.
You mentioned some things about our level of division in this country, and I was curious what your opinion was on slavery, because in the mid-1850s there was great division in this country, great division even within the church, and I think that division is necessary sometimes to fight this evil that you say is present in the world. I was wondering if you thought the same sort of division would be acceptable with abortion, because, as we know, estimates are that millions of children, young children, have lost their lives because of abortion. And that's a very, very divisive issue in this country. Would you say that there's sometimes a time for division and a time not for division?
Well, there's always a time for clear conviction, and the slavery question was one of those. And I remember I just read a long essay just this week on Finney and his relationship to division in the churches and the issue of slavery. And he really wrestled with that question. He wanted to preach to everybody who would come, but his strong stance on slavery sometimes dissuaded people from coming to hear his preaching. And he wrestled with that issue. I have a long chapter here. One of the 7 big choices is called Life and Dignity, Critical Choices. I'm a Bernardin disciple, Cardinal Bernardin. The consistent ethic of life, I think, is one of the best contributions of Catholic social teaching to our politics. I'm an evangelical convert to Catholic social teaching, and you'll find a lot of this book really mirrors the bishops on a number of things. But I like Bernardin's wider agenda, where all the assaults on human life are important to us. Darfur, abortion. I was at this Family Research Council, a meeting this fall, debating Richard Land. And the night before, CBS did a show interviewing Richard and I about the evangelical agenda. Then he did some polling that showed that poverty was now at the top of the list for evangelicals. And Richard said, is poverty more important than unborn lives? Did they talk to you? And the audience said, no. And I said, Richard, let's not pit unborn lives, unborn children, against poor children. This is the wrong battle. They're both in the category of the vulnerable. But this is the third rail of American politics. And we have had this legal, symbolic litmus test battle for years, and the abortion rate remains unchanged. So in the book, I talk about some new efforts, even in the Congress, where a new consensus might be built about serious, dramatic reduction in the abortion rate, where pro-life and pro-choice people might come together and say, rather than just having this endless debate that won't ever be resolved legally, let's try to do things that really work. Supporting, I was in California at the book table one day, and this woman came up and said, my daughter is graduating from Harvard this spring. I thought she was telling me because I teach there part-time. I said, that's great. It's a great school. You should be proud. She says, well, I am, but you see, when I was pregnant with her, I was a low-income mom on food stamps and Medicaid, and if I didn't have food stamps or Medicaid, I would have aborted my daughter. And a tear comes down her cheek. She says, you tell people that. You tell people supporting low-income moms like me is one of the best ways to reduce the abortion rate. And I promised her I would. And so Congressman Ryan, Tim Ryan, Rosa DeLauro, others are really, and it hasn't gotten the kind of press I think it should. The Abortion Reduction Act now in the Congress, and one thing, EJ, I've said, whichever Democrat is nominated, I'm going to press the Democrat, whoever that is, to make abortion reduction a plank in the Democratic Party campaign this year in this election.
Thanks.
Oh, okay. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here tonight. I count myself extremely privileged, especially when I consider that there's a very grumpy babysitter at home with 3 small children, enabling me to come and enjoy this. And I want to take a bit of a turn back to something, Reverend Wallis, you said earlier tonight, where faith produces hope, which produces action, which produces change. Put some handles on the action part for us. You're going to go across the country mobilizing what amounts to a social army here for the good. And we, a lot of us, forgive me for misusing the book title, have a Mary heart and a Martha world, where we have these yearnings to take the marketplace of ideas into the reality of changed lives and changed neighborhoods. How do we take what this yearning and this excitement and this hope and turn it into something that we can feel proud to be a part of in the way of action?
You know, we're going to try pilot experiment with this first Justice Revival in Columbus, Ohio in mid-April. The book tour will be over, we're going to put that aside, and then go in for several nights running in Columbus and talk about the kind of call to faith and justice that could change Columbus as a city. So I met recently with the churches there, the church leaders there, and I remember the morning meeting was with the 14 large church pastors. This is like mega churches, 8,000 members apiece, half black, half white. And they were talking about their flourishing churches and how much growth they have and how much excitement there is, and it was very exciting. But then I said, I'm really impressed by your stories, but I have a question. I have a disconnect. Disconnect is flourishing churches, failing city. Flourishing churches, failing neighborhoods. I've got a friend, I told him, a black pastor in Boston, who one night, a Saturday night, a young man was shot to death on the steps of his church. And he had to ask himself, am I responsible for what happens on the steps of my church when we're not there? He decided that he was, but not just the steps, but the neighborhood and the city. That led to the 10-point coalition that EJ knows about, that the youth homicide rate dropped 70%, in part due to the efforts of those black pastors began walking the streets. And so I asked these pastors, what's your parish? Do you have a parish? Or just the folks who come? Is Columbus your parish? A parish is what St. Catherine's is responsible for these 12 square blocks, for what happens here. Whether the people are believers or not, we're responsible, says the Catholic notion of parish. I asked them what their parish was. Did they want to make Columbus their parish? They all signed up for the Justice Revival. I think we're not going to, too often we go around, we have great evenings and great crowds, and we walk away from excited people, and it's a one-night stand. And we don't leave anything behind except excitement and people ready. And I think they're ready to do something. They want to join something. So we're going to try this for a better part of a week in Columbus. And churches are going to be preaching justice for the month running up to this and then afterwards. And the churches said, well, what do you need us for? Not to draw the crowd, you can do that. I said, we need you for what happens afterwards. So how can the parish become Columbus? And so the school superintendent's coming, and to appeal to the church to adopt 50 public schools, to take responsibility for those schools and what happens there, changing the lives of those kids. So we're going to experiment with what this could mean at the grassroots, and then it's got to, change doesn't trickle down, but it does rush up. And that's, I think, where we're headed.
Could I just say something on that, because I think it's a great question. I am very excited about what's happening among Americans under 30 years old, under 35 years old. And I think you're seeing a very interesting set of developments in this generation. We've had, I think, a false division between two things, two sets of false divisions. One, social problems are only solved through one-on-one interaction, personal help, or no, that doesn't solve problems. Social problems can only be solved by serious government programs. Well, the truth is you can't solve social problems with one or the other. You need both. And in our history, the people who led social reform movements were often those who began their lives, like the folks in the settlement houses around the turn of the century, deeply engaged in the problems of individual poor people. And over time, they decided, Jim's great analogy, if people are floating down the river, you want to find out why they're being thrown in the river or falling in the river upstream in the first place. If you want to solve these problems, you've got to help people one-on-one and also help them help themselves. But you also sometimes, often, need to do this systematically. You have to worry about schools and jobs and incomes and where the jobs are, how people can move there. And so you end up linking the personal and the social, and that, you know, this new generation, only Steve Trachtenberg would put it like this. He said, these kids are incredibly dedicated. They find lepers and they read to them, you know, Steve Trachtenberg said. I mean, this is an amazing bunch of, a generation you're seeing out there in terms of service and patriotism, which I would distinguish, by the way, from a narrow nationalism. The other is the split between personal responsibility and social responsibility. And I think, you know, Jim and I think, are both excited by this moment, because I think we're rediscovering as a country that these two things are linked, and that we need to ask more of ourselves as individuals and each other, and that people do, if you care about poverty, you do have to care about family values, not define family values as discriminating against gays and lesbians, but as a responsibility of people who have children and what their obligations are to their kids. But you also have to have social responsibility, because it's a whole lot harder. The other flip side is, if you care about family values, you got to care about social justice. Then you have to worry about how work is organized, how parents can do their jobs. And so I think we're breaking down some of these false divisions that have gotten in our way. There really are compassionate conservatives out there, not used as a political slogan to cover up inaction by government, but they are conservatives who care passionately about the poor and who believe in this one-on-one action. And I see at least some real possibility right now that these streams could join together and form a mighty river of change.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Maureen Walsh. I'm a grad student in the program focusing on religious pluralism here at Georgetown. And my question is, I would like you to speak to the element of, or the interfaith element that would be involved in your movement, both in the U.S. and then on the international scene as well. Please. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I teach this course at Harvard sometimes in the fall, and I did this fall. And I'm always really excited by like Muslim women. I get some of the best Muslim women. They're just really, really impressive young students, and they have a very different vision of Islam than Osama bin Laden does, and they're quite formidable. They're going to be reckoned with. You know, Judaism is going through I spoke last month to a conference of 6,000 rabbis, our friend David Saperstein, and there was this just horde of young Jewish students, emerging leaders who were going around everywhere together. So I think there really is a new conversation. Daisy Khan, who is organizing Muslim women around the world, she came and spoke to my class this year, and she was really dispelled a whole lot of stereotypes about what Muslim women think and don't think, and she's literally risking her life to do what she's doing, and she was really made a great impact on our students. So she and I talk a lot. She talks about Quranic revival. And she too believes, like I do, that the answer to bad religion isn't necessarily secularism, but is better religion. So how do we confront the fundamentalisms in our great traditions? And that's where I think our link will come by way of interfaith. There are prophetic traditions in all of our great religions. So when I went to the rabbis in San Diego, I said, well, you're going to be surprised to hear an evangelical who's a disciple of Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great rabbi. And I quoted Heschel back then, because Heschel's book on the prophets is the best thing that anyone's ever written about the prophets. So I think, and King and Heschel were at Selma together, marching side by side. The book talks about that story. So I think we're going to see a new generation of interfaith collaboration. And I'd often tell a story about how when we're going to have an action in the White House, in the rotunda of the Capitol once, when they were making more cuts to poor people's programs, and we had 55 Christians who work on the streets, working with the poor, like EJ said, going to go and protest this. So Michael Lerner called me, the rabbi, and said, "Can you use a rabbi?" I said, "Sure. We're going to do Isaiah. You can read the text." And so he came and said, "Woe to you, legislators, who pass infamous laws denying the poor among my people of their rights." And he read the text. We're all wearing our clergy costumes, and when you pray and read scripture and sing in the rotunda, you get arrested. And so we were all arrested and taken to jail. And then here's Tony Campolo, the Baptist evangelist, and Michael Lerner having a discussion in the D.C. jail on a bench about who was Jesus Christ, Christology in the D.C. jail. And it wasn't, I'm okay, you're okay. It was like, let's have a serious conversation. Who was this man, Jesus? And I got it. That's it. We all get arrested for our faith and talk theology in jail. Last question.
Just again, thanks for being here. This has been a fantastic experience. This is kind of tied to the former question about interfaith, but while we've chatted a lot about personal faith on the rise and fervor and compassionate aspects affecting social justice, what would you say the role of political correctness and the relativist take that's also on the rise? I notice on college campuses, there's a lot of debate between absolute and relativist. And how do you think, if it's a big enough deal, we can bridge that gap to further social justice?
Let me just try. The term political correctness has become so freighted. Does political correctness mean that you're not supposed to say racist or sexist things? Well, in that case, I think it's wrong to say racist and sexist things. I don't deny somebody's right in a free country to say whatever they want, but I don't think sort of having social opposition to racism or sexism is a terrible thing. It becomes a terrible thing when it gets in the way of authentic inquiry about how do you solve problems, how do we relate to each other, and when you can't speak freely about a particular point of view. And I teach a course on religion and politics at Georgetown, and I love my course because I love the students who take it, who range from very staunch secularists and atheists who oppose the very title of the course, don't think the two should ever link, all the way over to devout evangelicals, many people from African American traditions, liberal and conservative Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. And so we have a very free, open conversation. I always tell my students, at a university, no one should ever feel intimidated about their point of view. And in any room, there's always a majority, and I promise you that no matter what my point of view is, I'm going to take the side of whoever the minority in this class is in a debate, because I don't ever want you to feel shut down. So in that sense, that it can be a danger, but I think we can find the balance. And I just, the question before, I think the two link together, and then I want to let Jim close this out. There's a wonderful Jesuit writer, this is a Jesuit university, called David Hollenbach. And he argued that if you believe in religious freedom, there is an even stronger idea than tolerance. I mean, tolerance is good. It's certainly better than the alternative. But he talks about intellectual solidarity. And I think intellectual solidarity is a wonderful idea because you practice it not just across faiths, but between believers and unbelievers as well. I mean, my problem with the neo-atheist writers is not that they are making the assertions they make. In fact, I admire atheists for taking the question of God so seriously and putting believers on the spot. It's when they fall into the same kind of dogmatism that they condemn in others. And intellectual solidarity, you accept the idea that you put your views at risk, that we all need to give and receive help on the road to truth, and we challenge each other. It's not a wishy-washy thing, intellectual solidarity, because you can say hard things to your friend and argue back and forth, but you do that in a situation where you put your views at risk and know that you just might be converted, and that you have to be open to that. And I think the best settings for these discussions, other than jail, are often in shared projects where people come together to solve problems and get things done, and that's when they enter this dialogue and probably find more openness to each other in the course of a shared project.
You know, I had the same experience in our class up at Harvard, where I had a student this time that I just love this kid. He says, I'm a friendly atheist. I'm here to build bridges and make up for Hitchens. And, you know, and he wrote this brilliant paper I just read this week about the common ground that he thinks is possible after being in that course for a semester. And it's around that very thing. How can we join together in projects for the common good? And in the course of doing this work, let's have a serious conversation about the big issues and what we believe and why and all the rest. I think it's an open, very open thing now around the country. Let me close with a story in Nashville on the book tour. And in Nashville, you don't do a lecture or a book signing, you do a concert. So we sold out the Bellacourt Theater twice in the same night. Jars of Clay played and Emmylou Harris, and I got to preach, and it was fun. But this disc jockey, he said, I'm a secular Jewish country music songwriter and disc jockey, but I love your stuff. I've been following this thing, and I think it's a movement growing, and I think it needs a name. I said, I got a suggestion. So I said, well, what's your suggestion? He says, now remember, he's secular Jewish country music songwriter. Call yourselves the red letter Christians. You know that stuff in red in the Bible, the stuff that Jesus said? He said, I love the red shit. The rest I can do without. You know, he loves the red stuff. And so there's a whole different conversation now. And it's an open, creative, dynamic conversation. And some of you in a more postmodern mindset can help with this, because it isn't just a battle between, you know, points of view that sort of are in the air and never hit the ground. The Greek notion of learning is you learn stuff and spit it back. The Hebrew notion of the truth was that you don't know something until it has changed your life in some way. Learning as formation, not just information, and that's in your Jesuit tradition here, is really the answer to this. Show what you believe, not by how well you argue, but by how well you live. And then have a conversation with those who want to live that way together and see where you come out. We want to thank you very much for a great evening, and sign up for Sojourners on your way out, and thank you very much.